Hi there, welcome to Somewhat Overfitting, the podcast about data science and digital transformation. My name is Jonas, and every other week I'm interviewing people in the field of data science on how they are using data in their day-to-day business life. Guest in this episode is Matt Hilburn, Vice President of Research and Marketing at the Economic Development Corporation of Utah. Matt did a Bachelor's in Economics and Business and a Master's degree in Econometrics. Matt and I talked about what the EDCUtah does and his job there. We also discussed where marketing research fits into the data science field and how it differs from market research. We then talked about how the EDCUtah uses surveys, focus groups, and one-on-one interviews for their research. At the end, Matt described what in his analytical toolbox is and gave some tips for students and companies on how to start out with data science. So let's get started. Matt, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me, Jonas.
You are Vice President of Research and Marketing at the Economic Development Corporation of Utah. Could you tell us a little bit about your background first?
Yeah, great question. So I, as the Vice President of Research and Marketing at EDCUtah, we strive to provide data to companies that want to move to Utah. And it's a really cool job. It's one of those jobs, you don't really grow up thinking to yourself, I want to do economic development. But it's something that I kind of fell into because of my background. I went to the University of Utah. I received an undergraduate degree in economics, minor in business, and pursued a master's degree in econometrics, which for those who don't know is basically just an applied statistics degree. It's applying statistics to different business or economics principles. I've worked primarily in marketing research at a couple of different marketing research firms where we try to help customers and clients with product development and client satisfaction. And then got recruited to EDCUtah, the Economic Development Corporation of Utah, where we help bring businesses to Utah. One of the things that a lot of people don't know about us is when we bring a business to Utah, they don't bring people with them. If, for example, we brought Goldman Sachs here. So when Goldman Sachs moved here years and years ago, they put their feet down here in Utah and then they hire amongst Utahns. And so our goal is to bring those businesses here to provide jobs for recent graduates and for experienced professionals so that we can continue to see great job growth here in the state. What is your job right now as the Vice President of Marketing and Research? Yeah. My job right now, I know it sounds like I cover two departments. I cover three. One is research, one is marketing, and one is community strategy. So my job as the Vice President of Research and Marketing is the high-level explanation is to promote the state of Utah as a really great place for businesses, which it actually is. It's easy to sell a product that you're already good at. Utah is actually a very good place for business. We've got low cost, we've got great labor, it's all there. So my job is to help promote the state of Utah to people outside of the state through using marketing and through using really excellent data to prove why we're great at that. So we do that through the marketing team that are really excellent marketers, and then the research team provides all of the data for that. And we're generally sharing the message of here's what kind of labor we have. Here is what our real estate rent lease rates look like. Here are the different industries we have in the state of Utah. And then we target different industries. But then the community strategy department that I manage as well, that consists of two individuals who work with Utah businesses to help Utah businesses grow and expand as well. So we haven't forgotten about those really excellent companies we have here in the state already that are looking to grow and looking to hire more people. So that team is dedicated towards helping them.
Great. And the data you are collecting, is that mainly used for advertising the state, or is that also the data that is then used and provided to the companies that they can use the data to know how to grow here?
Yeah, it's both. We use most of our primary data, the data where we go out and we collect perceptions or feedback. Most of that data is used to inform our marketing efforts. You really don't want, marketing can really be a black hole of money. If you want to do an advertising campaign, it can get really expensive. So you want to know that the marketing that you're putting out is founded in data, that you can feel really confident that the messages you're sharing are effective and that the audience you're targeting are the correct audiences. So we do marketing research to collect primary data to inform those marketing efforts, but we collect a lot of secondary research from places like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the U.S. Census Bureau, and other public sources. And we use that data primarily for responding to the actual business requests. So let's say you're a business in California, you're interested in moving to Utah, and you contact us. Most of the data we would provide them would be showing them that secondary publicly available data, helping them understand why Utah is a great place. Now, you might ask, if it's publicly available, why do they need us? A lot of these, if you're not a professional researcher, a lot of these data sources are kind of hard to navigate. If you go into the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they have a wealth of information, and it can be quite hard to find, if you wanted to just know how much money does the average software developer make in Salt Lake City, Utah. It'd be quite difficult to find that on the website. So we specialize in knowing how to access that data.
Yeah. And before we jump a little bit deeper into what data you are using, could you try to put the term marketing research in the field of data science? Absolutely.
Data science and marketing research are related in many ways. Data science is probably a little bit more of a hardcore, a lot more numbers based, whereas marketing research blends a little bit of the creativity that comes through marketing. So no marketing research effort should be employed without the use of great data and great analytics. And that's where data science comes into play. If you want to run a campaign where you're trying to determine A/B testing, which landing page on your website resonates more, which product is resonating more, product optimization studies measure. Think about your iPhone. How do they determine how large the screen should be versus how long the battery lasts? They could make the battery last much longer than they currently do, but it would cost more money. And so you've got to balance all those different features. Well, data science answers those questions. It allows us to assign probabilities to different features of a product that we can then add up to identify the perfect mix and combination of features to create the iPhone that sits in our pocket today. That Apple has figured out that perfect combination is what's going to result in the most revenue and the most sales from customers. And that's where data science really plays a heavy role. Marketing is not very useful without the background of data. My creativity or my personal preferences would lead that effort without data, but I really want to know more about what my customer thinks than my own personal preferences.
Right. So how then does marketing research differ from classical market research?
They're often used synonymously. So there are some differences depending on who you're talking to, where market research can tend to be more on the macro level economics type of research, where you're understanding basic consumer behavior and CPI, the cost of goods, and you're understanding pricing differences between different markets. Salt Lake City is a much cheaper market than San Francisco. And so
by far.
Market research identifies a lot of those differences, whereas market research tends to be research that is much more focused on customers and understanding the particular customer of a particular company. How do we get that person to buy more money, to be more loyal, to like the product more, and engage with our brand more?
So you said you use, on the one side, like data that is publicly available. Do you also do some research as well by yourself?
We do, yeah. And I think it's something that not a lot of companies are focusing enough on. We hear a lot about people say a lot about how, they want to hire data scientists and they want to do great marketing research. They want to be data driven, but a lot of companies struggle to know exactly how to do that. And I think that's why it's so important that, particularly for students who are going through school right now, ironically, a lot of time those students can get into the job market and do a little bit of the teaching, to their bosses in a way, depending on where you go to work, because those efforts are not often employed as well as they could at other companies. So we we write surveys and send surveys. We have two main groups of of two main targets. One would be executives of companies. If a company wants to move to Utah, the executive makes that decision. Well, you can imagine that's kind of hard to target. If we wanted to, do a marketing campaign, that would be very expensive because most companies aren't actually interested in moving their business. How do you find those ones who are? Well, we found that the most effective way of reaching them is to work with real estate organizations. And there are individuals called site selector consultants or location advisors. And when a company wants to move, they tend to go to a site selector and say, hey, we're thinking of moving. Will you help us move? So if that site selector is really familiar with Utah or other states, then they can do a really good job directing that client. So we've discovered that the site selectors are actually the best people for us to market to, help them know Utah, because then they can share the Utah story. So we send surveys to site selectors and ask them, what are your perceptions of Utah? How much do you know about Utah? And then we analyze that data. We do regression analysis, logistic regression and linear regression and ANOVAs and all that good stuff to identify what are the things about Utah that most increase the likelihood that a site selector would recommend Utah as a place to do business to one of their clients. And then those are the areas that we start marketing to site selectors. And we find gaps where maybe a site selector on average says that Utah does not have a good pro-business environment. Well, we do. And so that would be an area where we would learn of a gap and say, okay, great. Now we know for the next 12 months, let's focus all of our site selector marketing materials on the fact that Utah is a great pro-business environment, and let's show data to prove why. So that's the type of data collection that has really improved the perception of site selectors in their feelings towards Utah. We do that same study over multiple years, and perception of site selectors over time has continued to increase as we've made it.
Yeah. And the survey that you sent out, would that be, for example, a question like, what is your perception of the pro-business environment in Utah? And then it would be 1 equals good and 5 equals bad, or how are you quantifying that in a survey?
Yeah, we have some questions like that where we'll be very direct and we'll just say, what is your opinion of Utah's pro-business environment on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being excellent. And sometimes, if you really get tricky with it, you start realizing that you can find what's called a latent variable, which is a variable that's kind of hard to measure by combining other variables. So in other words, if I want to measure how a site selector feels about Utah's pro-business environment, I might say something like, how do you feel about our lease rates? Are our lease rates a good deal? How do you feel about Utah's business regulations? How do you feel about Utah's business taxes? And then on the back end, as we're using data science to analyze that data, we can sort of create some indices and some composites to combine some of those factors together to create an overall score where we can say, hey, okay, we've combined all these business factors and maybe they're low in one area and high in another area, and we've clustered some of those variables, and we're calling that cluster of variables pro-business environment or perception towards pro-business environment. And there are some cool techniques you can use. A PCA, principal component analysis, or factor analysis is a great approach to take multiple variables and try to find an underlying theme. And so sometimes we use things like that as well. But the key to good survey writing is making sure that you don't have a lot of open-ended questions. You ask, well, I don't really know how to write a question that just lists options. That's where your pre-research comes in, and doing exploratory analysis. And you call up a site selector and you say, hey, when you're thinking of moving a company to a new location, what kinds of things are you thinking about? And they'll say, oh, well, we're thinking about lease rates, and we're thinking about universities and that kind of stuff. So now you're starting to get your information so that when you build your quantitative survey, you can actually have drop downs where you can say, please rate real estate rates and universities. And that way you're taking a lot of the work away from the general population you send the survey to.
And do you also use comparison, for example, to another state? When you say rate the universities, would you be like, rate the universities in Utah, or rate the perception of the quality of the graduates or the universities in Utah compared to California, Nevada, or whatever state that would be?
Sometimes it gets really tricky. In fact, we really wanted to look at a particular measure, and what we realized was when you ask someone, how do you feel this compares to other states? Asking someone to rate real estate lease rates against 50 states obviously becomes really tricky. So like you said, then you start to realize, okay, well, could we just say, what are the 3 states that are most important? So yes, then you could say, well, how does Utah compare to Texas, California, and Washington state? 3 of the states that Utah competes with the most in corporate recruitment, for example. Another alternative that we've done in the past is we've said we have a qualifier question that says, have you worked with other states on corporate recruitment? If they say yes, then we'll say, how does Utah compare to the other states? Are we better, about the same? Are we worse? So you can be really specific, but just making sure that you're making the survey really easy for the respondents so that they're not having to answer 50 questions. But also sometimes you can be a little more generic, such as just saying, well, are we better or worse than other people you've worked with? And I have found a lot of times in data science, I'm a statistician, and so I very much love, the numbers and being very precise. But sometimes when it comes down to marketing, you kind of just want to know the direction. Are we better or are we worse? Should we focus more on pro-business environment or less? And sometimes just knowing the general directionality can help us make decisions.
Yeah. So the main source of your data would be third-party data from the Census Bureau. Your
one source, Census, economic impact organizations, Bureau of Labor Statistics, workforce services organizations. All those, the government actually collects a lot of data on workforce and on industry. That's the primary source. It's easy to access. It's available. The problem with that type of data is it doesn't always meet your very specific objective. So if somebody asks us, how much does the average software developer in Salt Lake City make, or how much does the average data scientist make, we can pull that data. The Bureau of Labor Statistics already has that data. If somebody asks us, what is the general sentiment surrounding, free speech, in Salt Lake City? Well, that data doesn't exist. And so that would be something we'd have to go out and now send out a survey and collect the data. So you always want to try to find secondary data or existing data if you can, but it doesn't tend to have, you have a harder time finding the data that meets your specific objectives when you do that. So then you have to shift to primary data, and the challenge with primary data is it can be expensive.
Yeah, I bet. That's like in primary data expensive by making your own survey or also by buying it from somebody who...
Yeah, all of the above. So if you're lucky enough that you know how to write surveys, you can save that cost. But if you need to pay someone else to write a survey, that's a cost. You then have a software program like Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey. Now, some are cheaper. SurveyMonkey and SurveyGizmo don't cost quite as much. They're not as good as Qualtrics. I don't recommend using things like Google Forms or Google. Those things just have greater limitations, which make the response rates lower, and you can get false information. And then the final piece is panel data. So if you have a list of email addresses, for example, like us, we have email addresses of about 900 site selectors. So we get to send our survey directly to them. But if on the other hand, let's say I'm doing a survey for Apple, and I'm sending out, they do their own surveys, but let's say I'm a survey for Apple, and I'm really just trying to send it out to the general population. I just want to know, what does the average person think about the iPhone? Well, to do that, you have to hire what's called a panel company. And those companies are companies who will go out and find responses for you. They'll get email addresses for you. They'll get phone numbers for you. And that can be very expensive. You're looking at least $5 per response. And if you're doing a quantitative survey, you're going to want a couple hundred, responses, depending on how large the population is. You might want thousands of responses. So if you're thinking at $5 to $10 per person, that gets expensive really fast. So ideally, you'll have access to the email addresses of your customers. And that's why a lot of businesses today, they'll ask, what's your email address? What's your phone number? Sign up for our newsletter, sign up for our coupons. That's really not just to send you coupons. Part of it is so that they can track your spending behavior. And part of it is so that they can communicate with you in the future about surveys and research needs that they have. Yeah.
Do you also conduct focus groups, or would that be too expensive for the scale that you need?
Yeah, that's a great question. EDCUtah doesn't usually do focus groups. I've done I think 2 focus groups is all since I've been here in the last 6 years in Utah. My personal opinion, you've got sort of the 3 approaches to primary data collection. You've got survey writing, the focus groups, and you've got IDIs, in-depth interviews. I find that I like in-depth interviews better than focus groups. There is a place for all of those. So you really just need to know what your objectives are of the study. But in-depth interviews are very broad, right? I can sit down for 45 minutes with one person and I can get a lot of information from them. A focus group is a little less broad. I've got the same 45 minutes, but now I've got 8 to 12 people, and you're battling with people who have really strong personalities versus sort of that sheep mentality.
Right. Yeah.
You can kind of end up getting a lot of people just sort of being agreeable. And then you've got the quantitative survey, which is actually not broad at all, right? You've got 5 to 10 minutes to get information. So very limited time, but now you can send it to a mass of people. And that's where statistical inference is applicable, which is not applicable at the focus group or IDI level. So I've done focus groups. I think they're great and they're really valuable under certain circumstances, but I tend to lean more towards a one-on-one sit down with about 10 people rather than a focus group of 10 people. It takes more time though.
Do you use that then, for example, in the beginning before you start a survey to get like the questions to ask?
I'm so glad you asked that. The survey, the research process can be a little bit different depending on your objectives, but in general, it follows a very standard process, which is your first step, you discover what the objectives are of your client or of yourself. What is it we're trying to accomplish? Then you do secondary exploratory research. You identify all the data that already exists on our topic. So let's say you're a university and you're trying to improve enrollment in the school business. So what you're going to want to do is find out what other universities have already done research like this, and have any of them published that. Let's find out what they learned and what they did. Then you move on to in-depth interviews. So now you're going to interview industry experts. You're going to interview students. You're going to interview those other colleges that have already made improvements. Then potentially focus groups. And all along the way, you're educating yourself and you're learning more and more about what you need to do in order to accomplish your objective until you finally get to that online quantitative survey, which by then, hopefully you've learned enough from the previous steps that you can have a rock star online quantitative survey. Because at the end of the day, it's pretty hard to, recommend to a university, school of business, hey, you should make these 5 changes if all you've done is talked to 10 people from in-depth interviews and 10 people in a focus group. What if that wasn't representative of the larger public? So then you're really relying on that online quantitative survey of hundreds of students and their feedback to be what's going to guide your recommendations. And that's why you do all that work just to make sure that your 8-minute survey is perfect. And that's where you're going to make all your recommendations from.
Great. And the EDCUtah it seems like they are doing the marketing and then kind of in quotation marks waiting for the businesses to come to Utah. And then you would offer them statistics and data in some way or the other. Would that be in like a report, like a X amount of sites of PDF being like that's the major points, or would it be a dashboard in some kind, or is there a dashboard that you can send out where it's like that's how our stats are at the moment?
You nailed the question we ask ourselves every day on what is the best approach. So we have the majority of businesses do reach out to us directly. We have a small group that goes proactively and tries to find businesses to move to Utah. But to answer your question, it's generally, I know in school we learn a lot about writing reports, and that continues to be important in a lot of realms in business. In a lot of the reasons I write a lot of reports. But generally, with a lot of business topics, it tends less to be about reports and more about, to your point, just spreadsheets. So most of the time when we're sending data to companies about, wages in Utah or lease rates or utility rates, normally it's in a spreadsheet. We pull all that data into a spreadsheet, send it off to them. And part of the reason for that is it takes more time to write up a report. And there's also, when you write a report, that's usually because you're giving it to someone without the benefit of being able to present it to them. And that's what we see in PowerPoint presentations today as well, where we kind of will build this really long, in-depth PowerPoint presentation, and then we'll kind of click through each slide and we'll read the slides and all that. Multimodality is a PowerPoint presentation should simply be a visual aid to your vocal presentation. So what might be a 30-page PowerPoint presentation should maybe only be 5 slides with 5 graphs, So we tend to just send the data through Excel, sometimes through Word, and then we hop on the phone with them and we walk them through what we've sent them, explain to them, let them ask any questions. And sometimes they do end up being a report. For example, we were the ones who bid on the Amazon EDCUtah project a few years ago. We sent a 200-page proposal for that. It was very long. Took us a long time to put together. I think it was 101 pages. So sometimes we do still need to write reports.
Yeah. And those Excel files, would they include graphs or are they the raw data? Or is it like?
Yeah, it's both. It's usually just the raw data, but often graphs as well. As a guy who loves data visualization, I always want to use graphs as much as I can. But the interesting thing that I think we lose sometimes when we get really focused on data visualization is we forget that tables actually sometimes are the most appropriate visualization.
Yeah.
We think of data, we think of a table as being what we're trying to get away from. And in general, that is true. But if you've got a really large table with a lot of data points, converting that to a graph can actually make it more difficult to comprehend. There's too much going on. So yes, we use graphs when we can, but don't be afraid to use a table if you've got too much data. Sometimes a table is the best way to go.
What was your biggest challenge so far in your work since you graduated from college?
My greatest challenge is finding mentors. I found that, like I mentioned previously, there really aren't a lot of data scientists out there. Some going through school, it kind of feels like it because we have a lot of friends who are, but the typical business doesn't have a lot of them. And when they do, everybody kind of has their own specialty. And so sometimes, a machine learning engineer or a data scientist or a statistician. I personally consider myself a statistician. I use Python in the work that I do. And I don't know very many people who are experts at Python. And I don't know very many people who, if I'm working on a linear regression and I come up with sort of a funky thing happening in my data that maybe I'd like some advice on, there's not a whole lot of people I can turn to. So I have a group of people some of my old professors and some people that I've worked with at analytics companies that I can turn to. But especially earlier on in my career, it's not so much of a problem anymore, but especially the first few years out of college, I just found that there weren't a lot of people I could really turn to kind of continue my education and help me to grow. And so I think it's important when you find someone who kind of knows what they're talking about, try to befriend them and try to, see if they'll be your mentor. And I find that sometimes it's nice to just be able to pick up the phone once a year, and call one of the professors and say, hey, I've run into this funky problem. What advice do you have for me? So finding those people who can help you out, I think that was my biggest challenge.
Yeah, and you overcome it by just like waiting till you met more, and then it kind of naturally evolved into like mentorships.
And it happened much more slowly than I wish it had.
Yeah, I bet.
I genuinely feel like I could have gotten as good as I am today faster if I had known some of those people sooner. So yeah, I would say in your college years, seek out people who are really great at what you're interested in, and try to retain those relationships for a long time. Because I for many years, I just had maybe one or two people that I thought I could kind of rely on, but it'd be better if they were at your job, because then you can talk to them multiple times throughout the day and get thoughts and advice. But at some of the companies that I've worked at, I'm the only statistician or the only scientist, and they're very much relying on me to be the expert, which on one end is really cool. They kind of believe everything you say, and you got to be careful. But on the other hand, it can be kind of scary because you're thinking, oh my God. In fact, as a few years ago, I provided some information to a particular organization, and maybe 6 months later, I found out about some big changes they had made, which were pretty related to the research I had produced. And I just was kind of talking to them about it, and they said, oh yeah, we made all those changes because of what you told us in your research. And I just thought, oh my God. Okay. Well, wow. I'm glad I did a good job, and I kind of want to go back and look it over and make sure I didn't get anything wrong. And luckily it was the right move, but there is a lot of responsibility in telling somebody. And I think that's another thing. We throw around data a lot these days, right? And we all have an opinion. When you're starting to recommend to people what they should do, you better be sure that the data you're using is accurate. You better cleaned it correctly, that you analyzed it correctly, and that you're interpreting it correctly, because they will make $1 million decision based off of what you said. So being able to have some people you can turn to help you in those cases is really important. So I did it sort of slowly. I started looking for people who were experts in the field, and kind of had to be a little bit more proactive about it. So yeah, find them, go to conferences, seek them out while you're still in school. And then when you get into industry, get to know other companies that do things that you love, and try to reach out to them on LinkedIn, and, attend professional development opportunities on the topics. Sawtooth is a great example. Sawtooth has a data science platform that does conjoint studies. Go to the Sawtooth conference. You'll meet a whole bunch of data geeks there, and stay in touch with them. Try and create a little bit of a community.
And then you mentioned that you use Python. Could you describe what is in your toolkit right now, what you use on a day-to-day basis, and also maybe where you store the data that you are collecting?
Yeah. I've used a lot of different programs over time. I started with programs like R and SAS, really liked them. I used SPSS, kind of evolved into using Stata. I know a lot of data scientists kind of stick to Python, but I use a lot of the other statistical software as well. And then I learned about a program called EDCUtah really early on in my career that I loved, and I kind of got back into it in later years. And then I learned Python not too long ago, as well, as it has gained popularity in the last few years, even though it's been around for quite a while. And so within Python, I do feel like Python is the best for me. And it's important. There's a lot of debate. What's the best program? And it really just depends on, I think, preferences almost more than anything. All the programs can do a great job. So it really has more to do with your expertise with that particular program and what you want to do with it. So I would say, before anything else, become an expert at a software program. That would be another challenge that I would cite is a lot of programs. Well, I didn't know any of them expertly. You need to just pick one. Just choose one early on in your career. Just pick one and become an expert at it. Once you're an expert at one, you can then learn another one pretty easily later on. But you just got to pick one, commit to it, and get really good at it. And right now, Python is the one that most employers are hiring for. So I would encourage Python, if anything, for that reason. So I do love Python. I think it's great. I use a lot of the libraries in it. Some of the cool ones that I really like, because I'm a big data visualization, there's a package in Python called Seaborn, Plotly, which are some really great visualization tools. I think a lot of times in data science, we get really excited about just going straight to a logistic regression or something like that. The reality is, if you'll really put your fingers in the data, it's quite fun, doing simple things too. Building graphs and looking at the data and understanding the data, and building histograms for your continuous data and your bar charts for your categorical data, and even simple things like crosstabs and t-tests and ANOVAs. Those can be really important. If I have a business objective, one of the things at EDCUtah, we have public sector members and private sector members. We wanted to know how those two groups differ. Well, that's a t-test, right? We just wanted to know how does, we'll just say average satisfaction. How does average satisfaction differ between public sector and private sector? Well, that's a t-test. That's not a logistic regression. And so we're limiting ourselves if we want to just jump to just that advanced stuff. We should know the whole toolbox. So I use all those different analytical tools regularly. And then you've got logistic regression, cluster analysis, factor analysis, PCA, things like that. But I feel like you'll be much more successful if you become comfortable with all the different statistical processes and machine learning processes. If you become comfortable with all the different packages in Python, so whether you're using, despite whatever interface you're using, whether you're using Spider or Jupyter or whatever it may be, PyCharm, take advantage of all the packages, the basics of Pandas and Matplotlib and all of them. And also play around with Seaborn and Plotly and couplings and some of those that can do a little bit more advanced stuff on the visualizations. But don't limit yourself by just doing what you think is the cool stuff. Even the simple stuff can be really powerful.
Yeah. Great. That's good to know. It's interesting to know, to go also into like the tools of like the statistical tools, not only always the software tools. It's like, oh, I use Python and I don't know, Power BI or something.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and you bring up, a good point with Power BI and Tableau are really great tools for visualizing a lot of that data as well. If you want to build a good dashboard, which we don't do a whole lot, but I think dashboards are going to become more and more popular over time. They're so simple. They're so easy to use.
Yeah.
They're so easy to interpret. And because companies are becoming more and more data driven, but yet you don't have a full staff of data scientists, the dashboards are easy for the typical person to understand. So I think those are becoming more and more popular.
Yeah. And how do you store the data from, for example, from your surveys? Would it be in a CSV file on a normal server, or do you put that in a database?
We really do just use CSV files. Yeah. Databases become important when you've got lots and lots of data. You really need to have a good database, and you need to learn SQL and do a great job with that. The primary research that we do tends to be, well, I should say this first, the secondary research we do, data collection, is quite limited. It's quite specific. Those are all files that, we let those stay on the government's servers, and we just pull what we need to. As far as primary data, when we do a survey of site selectors of say 800 or 900 site selectors, we get 200 or 300 responses. I just leave those in a CSV, and obviously I upload it to Python and analyze it in Python. But, I think that's another route where Excel is extremely powerful and databases have their place. If you're doing big data, you need a database. Don't get me wrong. If you're Apple, or if you're doing, some of these really big, you need a database. But I think in some ways, Excel almost gets criticized as being a little old school. But the truth is, Excel is extremely malleable, and it's very easy to play with the data. And, in software development, you almost never even look at the data. It's existing in the background, but you're typing code and you're doing things, never even looking at it. It's probably more of a personal preference where I want to physically see it. And, I want to feel it, and I want to look at it. And I feel like that approach for me has made me better when I'm standing in front of an executive who's going to grill me about, why I'm saying what I'm saying, and did you do this right? I feel like it's aided me to be able to say that I know that data so well. Yeah. So I prefer to just leave it in CSV, but if you're going to have more than a couple thousand rows, you definitely would need to throw that into a database.
All right. Thank you so much for all the insight. That was really interesting. Do you have anything you would like to add at the end that we might not have covered that you would like to talk about?
I would just say marketing research and data science is obviously a very fast growing field. There's still a lot of adoption that industries need to do. I think it's a faster growing field amongst students than employers right now. Employers want to get on board and they want to be data driven, but I think students actually get it better than employers do. And I hope that catches up soon. So it's a challenge in the industry to help businesses understand the value of research, the value of data. In their minds, they kind of think they get it. But when it comes to their checkbooks, sometimes they have a hard time investing in it.
Right.
You invest a lot of money in your marketing, right? All companies put a lot of money into marketing. You put money where your priority is. But there's not as many companies that have quite realized that they need to throw a lot of money at their data infrastructure and their data architecture and their data processes. So there's a lot of businesses that are still trying to catch up with that. So I think that's why the next generation of data scientists and data analysts can help with that as they get into the field, help convince businesses of the importance of it.
Would you have a tip for a company that is wanting to get more data driven and looking for people, but might be like, oh yeah, we need someone who is a little bit more experienced, but then has the issue that there might not be enough that have that experience, but more students like me, for example, who don't have a lot of experience. I was like looking into jobs and they always want like 2 years experience, 3 years experience. And when you say that there is not a lot of people available right now who have that experience, but mainly students, which don't have that experience, but the experience is important to some extent, right? Like when you come right out of school and am supposed to help building up a data department, do you have any tips for a company that might only in quotation marks have access to students right out of school, how to deal with that situation then?
Yeah, great question. So my first tip, I'm a vice president, so I make a lot of budget decisions. My current budget is about $600,000. I know what it means. My personal budget, not the company budget, my departmental budget. So I know what it means to have to compromise one thing you need for another thing. I totally get the competing priorities. So my first advice to a business is data is so much more important than you are giving it credit for. You have to spend more on it. You just have to. You are not going to be able to compete with your competitors. You're not going to be able to make the best decisions possible. Your gut is actually not good enough. You definitely need to start making that investment. So the next fiscal year, when you're sitting down for your budget discussions, just start allocating a little bit create a new line item for data analysis and for research, put some money into it, make that a priority. Second thing is, if all you can afford right now is you're working with students and working with, if that's all you can afford, I find that most of the universities around here have really great programs. University of Utah is a great example. I know the capstone program for the Masters of Business Analytics degree there at the university, they're always looking for projects for their students. And that's a cool environment because what you can do is work with, say, 3 or 4 students who are being supervised by a professor. So you're going to get quality work out of it. And then as you're working with that student, allow that to almost be like an internship for that student for your company, and then hire that student. So now you've worked with them, you know that they've done well. Of course, they're not a 20-year veteran in data analytics, but you know what they're capable of. And so now you've got someone that you can at least rely on for some important pieces. And then go find a consultant. There's a couple of research companies around here in Salt Lake City. Find a consultant who can come in and sit down with that student and advise them on different pieces of it. If you don't feel like you can afford $100,000 for an experienced researcher, just allocate a budget to have a consultant working with that student and that student's manager so that you can ensure that the student's on track. So just like when the student's in school having the professor helping out, same thing. Now you've got a consultant who's helping the student out. And that way you've got the student who's doing all of the work and you're able to afford the student, but you've got a consultant who's ensuring everything is staying on track.
Great. That is a good point with the consultant. And then maybe starting out in a capstone project, that is what I'm doing right now, actually. And then having the professor as the first to help them jump in, and then maybe take one or the other of those students who work on it already, know the company, had the experience with this with the professor, and then put a consultant next to them to help guide them.
Absolutely.
That's a great idea.
And as someone who's done hired a lot of interns, don't hire an inexperienced data scientist unless you know them, but know them. So, again, work with the universities. I know BYU does the same thing. So if you need a data scientist and all you can afford is a recent grad, I get the dilemma. It's kind of hard to hire someone right out of school if you don't have a data science department. So that's why you need to go through university. Find an excellent student through the university, get to know them, then hire them later and get a consultant.
Great. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Jonas.
That's it for today. Thanks for listening, and hit subscribe so you don't miss out on the next episode of Somewhat Overfitting. Thanks again to Matt for being on the show. Highlights of today's show were the insights into how to use focus groups and interviews to create a great survey, but also Matt's comment on how a company can start in the field of data science even when they do not have a huge budget for data science yet. Let me know what you thought about this episode on somewhatoverfitting.com. There you can also find today's show notes. If you have something to say about data science and digital transformation, visit somewhatoverfitting.com/guest and fill out the form. I'm always looking for interesting conversations. The theme song is from Bobby Rands and is called Jungles. Thanks again for listening, and see ya.